Hi, I'm Jacob.
I'm Michael.
And today we're reviewing the Beatles single, Strawberry Fields with Penny Lane, released in February of 1967. We're making the hop to the Beatles, and what a single to start with. So Strawberry Fields was released as a double A-side with Penny Lane, so there actually wasn't a distinct A and a B-side. And it was recorded at the end of the previous year, towards the end, kind of the proto-Pepper sessions after the band had stopped touring. And this was the first you'd heard of them after that and after the Revolver album.
You just touched on something that it was recorded and there hadn't been anything. There was Revolver and everybody loved the Beatles and was always waiting for the next thing. It was unlike anything that you had ever heard from the Beatles. It was not a sound that was even familiar. Unique drumming from Ringo that was just off the charts, different than anything. The vocal association and the way that John was singing the words and the almost stream of consciousness lyrically that was coming out got your attention and made you think about what it means. General recording and the orchestration, the cellos particularly, I had never heard on anything despite other orchestrations that was kind of coming into their records a little on Revolver, but nothing like this. The fade out was in line with the originality I was talking about, that it expressed itself musically. And to me, it had a melancholy. Even as a kid, I remember I used to think of the cellos as almost moaning at the end. It took a little getting used to, but not much. But it heralded the dawn of a new era, and something was up. It wasn't the Beatles you had known. It was a long way from the Beatles you had known. And just like that, you heard it with your ears, and then you saw it with your eyes when you saw that they looked completely different with mustaches. And then I guess, in looking back, it's considered the pre-Pepper era, and why weren't these songs on Sgt. Pepper? That's for the historians to debate. Strawberry Fields Forever was new and original. Just hearing the music, there was something changing.
It always sounds to me like, well, the truth is that John was struggling with how to produce this song. And it started as a soft acoustic song that we know when he was in Spain that he recorded. And then there was this Beatle version that is kind of in the first minute, right? Take 7, I think, is the first minute of the song. But it's very stop and go. And I remember when you hear the whole take, you're almost like, well, the song never really goes anywhere. It kind of builds up momentum, and then each verse drops off again. And with the orchestration, when you hear that version in take 20-something, it really sounds like they went into the lab. Like they put on their Beatle goggles, they go in the lab, and they go, okay, we're ready to bring in the future now. There were two very different attempts, and they stitched them together, but that essence is still throughout, that they're trying to invent something totally new that hasn't been done in pop music. Listening to it this time together, I still felt some of that stop and go. It feels a little bit forced together, but that's what makes it so beautiful. And then the orchestration you talked about, I always love the call and response of it. Nothing to get hung about, da-da-da, right, like follows him in a way that 4 years ago you would have had Paul or George singing that part, but instead now the orchestra is the one doing the talking, and so they've like elevated to this other place. And then the brass gets so dark in one section. While it's melancholy, it's also a nightmare, but then the same thing becomes like a dream, and so it's all kind of different perspectives of what he's saying. Then I think I mentioned this in one of our other videos, but one of my favorite lyrics of all time of John Lennon is the I think I know I mean, or yes but no, but it's all wrong, like the just stream of consciousness, the fact that that's a lyric is really beyond Lewis Carroll, but into like modern day, giving it that veneer of improv to show you that he's like, you know, vulnerable and you're in his mind, but obviously it's extremely measured and in the parameter of the verse. So I thought that's always a beautiful part. Then the solo at the end, I think it's Paul playing that guitar solo again, which is going to do something similar on Good Morning in a couple of months on Pepper. But that seems like this era of mid-60s Paul doing like these very aggressive 5-second long pentatonic kind of solos there. I love the touch that gives it, and then he's on the timpani, so he's adding, like you said, Paul gets a lot of credit for the feel.
Also the beginning of the mellotron, I never knew at the time, the mellotron.
That's Paul, yep. And I never noticed so obviously the fading back in, I mean, it's so hard now, we're jaded, but that was very unique at the time. I never noticed how when it fades in, it's like completely on an offbeat too. Falling and picking itself back up and getting into the structure of it. So what can be said about this song that hasn't already been said? I won't go into the whole history of what Strawberry Fields was. Just to say that this was one of the most complex recordings that the Beatles ever made, and certainly had ever made up until this time. All right, so we flip it over, although again, it's a double A-side, even though I think of Strawberry Fields as the A-side, but technically we could have done this either way. But we'll talk about Penny Lane. Although Paul claims he had started working on this song as far back as November '65, I'm guessing he really wanted to be counterpoint maybe to Strawberry Fields and fleshed it out even more to be about where they grew up and everything.
Radically different from Strawberry Fields, full of energy, and you could almost feel walking down the street and looking at all these places that he's talking about. But other than the content of the lyrics, which are magnificently done, the melodicism of Penny Lane is striking, and the way they recorded it, and the melody and the bass line that McCartney played was unlike anything ever, and just so melodic, and so maybe he respected and liked Brian Wilson and was watching and learning from each other, but Brian Wilson ended up in the sandbox from these songs. I could almost understand it, because this is a whole nother level. The thing you have to remember, and it's been talked about and maybe it's been said too many times, but it's amazing these songs came out before Sgt. Pepper. Penny Lane is this classic song about looking back on where you lived, and just got your attention equally as much as Strawberry Fields.
I think Penny Lane connects the dots to Revolver more than Strawberry Fields does. You can still picture, Paul was always in the corner working on some of these kind of sweeter pop songs, Good Day Sunshine or something that was a little bouncier, and that's what this feels like too. Like the piano is clearly a signature. I think it's 4 pianos playing something, similar chords all over the place, but giving it that full sound. It's just a very clean song all around. And the solos are like a beautiful note for note, perfect trumpet solo, and there's nothing gritty that seeps into this, like the darkness that's kind of hanging over Strawberry Fields. And so it's really good contrast, I think, to have both perspectives on here. The modulation at the end, I always very uplifting thing. Obviously, it's an old Beatles trick, but it works really well for a song like this. After all the fading out of Strawberry Fields and coming back in, and the heaviness of that, you have a song that just ends on Penny Lane, done.
This was the first Beatles single that didn't get to #1, and if I'm not mistaken, #1 was Release Me by Engelbert Humperdinck.
Yep.
Not to knock Engelbert or Jerry Dorsey, I think is his real name, but the point is that, are you kidding? That's all I have to say.
Yeah, it's like the thing that people loved about the Beatles. They took these risks. Now in hindsight, we know, it always paid off, and the industry followed them, and they always got to #1 anyway, But that's not why they were doing it. I don't think they cared. And I think they say in interviews it was a relief when it didn't get to #1, and maybe there's some hindsight there. But I don't think they did this to be #1 commercially. I think they did it because they thought it was musically where they wanted to express themselves and what they found good to listen to.
They always had a wonderful nonchalance about the multitude of groups in the British invasion that followed them, and periodically they'd be interviewed, or confidence that never wavered. I think once John said in reference to Dave Clark 5, well, maybe for a week we were wondering, who is this guy? But it became a joke to them, the drumming of Dave Clark. Nothing touched them. They liked the Animals with House of the Rising, but they had no fear about these groups. They just plunged ahead, and everybody followed in their wake. That's how I experienced it at the time.
All right, so that's Strawberry Fields. We'll pull out some other Beatles records soon.